Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Nutmeg Podcast for the 2019-2020 season. And in this episode, we're going to talk about Watford because I feel it may be appropriate to do so after some comments I made in the last Nutmeg Podcast episode. If you haven't watched it, go back and watch it now. It's a pretty good episode, but I'm biased. Anyways, what I said about Watford is they're one of my early picks to go down this season, which I think many people feel Watford are a fairly established Premier League team, perhaps even should be aiming for a high-ish finish, maybe 11 through 8 kind of position. But Watford will be relegated in my opinion. They're a team, despite being 11th in the Premier League last season, I see them as huge relegation contenders. This should be prefaced by the fact that there has only been 2 games in this season, and they, although being a small sample size, are a crucial sample size. 3-0 loss at home to Brighton and a 1-0 away loss to Everton aren't good. And the loss to Brighton could just be an early season anomaly. But it's a pretty fucking glaring anomaly this early on, especially considering Brighton are many other people's lock-on relegation contenders. So that really kind of shows you that 3-0 at home to Brighton is a bad result. But we're going to talk about those first 2 games first. The first game against Brighton, they got battered. They looked pretty awful. They didn't really have many clear-cut chances. And, they got run around the pitch by a Brighton side that just looked up for it on the day. Graham Potter has really taken charge there, and it shows. They've been good so far this season. They beat Watford 3-0 and a 1-1 draw to West Ham. In that game, Andre Gray had an amazing chance where Femenia basically just kept the ball in on the touchline, cut it back towards him, and he should have scored. There was no lift on the shot. It wasn't particularly powerful. Got blocked fairly easily by the Brighton defenders, and it wasn't very good. The goals that they conceded, there was an own goal from Abdoulaye Doucouré, which if you watch it, it's fairly confusing to kind of watch. You don't really know what he's doing. He's kind of trying to do a pass back from a foot away. It's just not going to work. Florian Andone managed to score near post. I mean, Florian Andone scoring against you. That's not exactly what you want to see if you're a Watford fan. And Neil Maupay took it around Ben Foster and slotted it home fairly easily on his Brighton debut. And that team was pretty standard Watford team when you look at the lineup, and they got battered. And the problem that I had with the Everton game was there was only one change, and they changed Andre Gray for Roberto Pereira, and that's not enough changes after a 3-0 loss to a relegation team, realistically. So they made the change for Pereira, and they had better chances in the Everton game. There was a Deulofeu cutback towards Deeney. It was kind of not a cutback, but a angled pass where you thought he was running in from the right, ran basically the width of the pitch, and pulled it back to where Deeney should have been. It was a place where if you've got a striker like Deeney, who's a tap-in target man, he needs to be there. And it was a great run from Deulofeu and not capitalised on by Deeney, who looked way off the pace in this game. Bernard scored the goal for Everton on the 10th minute, and my God, did Foster look bad on that one. Not getting down anywhere near quickly enough. Yes, it took a tiny little deflection on the way through, but he was nowhere near it. His legs kind of gave out on him if you watch the footage back. Foster looked really poor in this one. He missed a lot of balls up in the air that should have been keeper's ball. Troy Deeney missed a sitter on another good run from Deulofeu. It was saved by Pickford, but if you actually watch the footage, I'm pretty sure that's going over the bar anyway. So that's a hard one to watch if you're a Watford fan, and it may come as a surprise to a lot of Watford fans that I'm doing this video that Watford will get relegated, because they reached the FA Cup final last year and they finished 11th and had 2 top goal scorers, both on 11 goals. I think that may be a miscorrect stat, but they had 2 really good goal scorers anyway in Deeney and Deulofeu. But they got battered in that game, and they lost a lot of games near the end of last season, and they haven't started well this season. And I think to get a little bit of perspective on where this is all coming from, as far as my opinion on Watford, you have to go back to the 16-17 season. It was 2 seasons after they'd come up, And, well, the second season after they'd come up off of the promotion playoffs in the Championship. And they finished 17th in the 16-17 season. So one away from going back down. And that's not a promising sign for a team that's been 2 years in the Premier League. Yes, they finished 13th in their first year back in the Premier League, but 17th shows a clear decline and drop-off. But that becomes even worse when you look at their squad now, and there are 12 of those players that were in that team that prominently figure, that are prominent figures in Javi Gracia's starting lineup and substitutes bench consistently now. You've got Troy Deeney, Etienne Capoue, Jose Holovas, Sebastian Prodl, Daryl Janmat, Craig Cathcart, Tom Cleverley, Roberto Pereira, Abdoulaye Doucouré, Christian Kabasele, Isaac Success, and Adrian Mariappa. Not exactly names that you would think would stay after a near relegation season, or at least feature prominently, or you'd think that a lot of those would be replaced. And they haven't been. And to put that in perspective, Burnley finished on the exact same amount of points that year. And they only have 8 left from that team. And 8 still seems like a lot, but a lot of those players were much better than the players Watford kept. You're talking Tarkowski, Ben Mee, Matthew Lowton, players that are Premier League quality and consistently show that. So anyway, let's talk about that current team now. And if I read off their lineup from the Everton game, you've got Ben Foster in goal, Kiko Femenia at right back, Craig Dawson and Craig Cathcart at centre back, Jose Holovas at left back, Abdoulaye Doucouré, Etienne Capoue, Will Hughes, Roberto Pereira and Troy Deeney and Gerard Deulofeu. A lot of those names I've just named were on that near relegation side. The bench was Aurelio Gomez, Daryl Janmat, Cleverley, Danny Welbeck, Andre Gray and Domingos Queinas and Christian Kabasele. Again, a lot of those names I was talking about in that 16-17 relegation season. Which I know is only 2 seasons removed, but when you have a scare like that, you need to rebuild. So we'll talk about Ben Foster to begin with. Ben Foster was a highlight last season, which isn't a great thing. He's a 36-year-old goalkeeper who's Premier League level, looking back at his career, but lower end Premier League level. And he was a highlight last season. A highlight with only 7 clean sheets. And he gave up one of his higher goals per 90 at 1.55 per 90. I know 36 doesn't seem old for goalkeepers, but he's not one of the greats. He's not a Buffon. He's not a Van der Sar. He's not showing that he's consistently playing at the level he's been playing at his whole career at this age. And it's not very good that he's getting beat in that Everton game the way he did. If you go back and watch that footage, Bernard cuts in on the left, goes onto his right foot, swings it back near post. And Foster's just not getting down fast enough. Nowhere near. Nowhere near fast enough. And it just looks like he's off the pace, too old, and maybe he's his peak. That's what I think. Also, it's not like he's mentoring a backup. It's not like he's mentoring a young Watford goalkeeper coming up through the ranks. The backup that game was Aurelio Gomez, who is 38 years old and was probably going to retire last year if it wasn't for a massive influx of Watford support. Which I think was a bad thing for the club, because it could have been an option to bring in a younger keeper. Let's move on to right back. We've got 28-year-old Kiko Femenia, who's serviceable but not good. He's serviceable. He was an Alaves, Deportivo Alaves player when he was younger. He was an average prospect. He never really contributes to Watford too much. He's got a goal and assist last year and the same before, and no goals or assists in his busiest season of his whole career, which was his only La Liga season where he fully played in a first team. And looking at the data, when you look at Kiko Femenia, it just seems like a scouting mistake that honestly they've kind of come out of the good side on. Because looking at it, he should never have been picked up by a team like Watford. He's just not really good enough. And you look back at his stats, and he played in Alaves, and he played a lot of League 2 in Spain. It could have ended up a lot worse for Watford, based on looking at his time before going to Watford. They're kind of lucky he's as average as he is. And Watford kind of know that he's average, because his backup 30-year-old Daryl Janmat got a few games last year. And by a few, I mean 18 appearances. And that's not a few, that's quite a few. So they kind of know that he's a problem. And if you look at some of the key stats, like assists and shots on target per 90, Janmaat may be a better option. And that's not a good thing. Let's move on to Craig Cathcart at centre-back. He's an okay defender. He's been at Watford for a while. And was okay his first year when they came up. And when they finished a pretty respectable 13th. He was a part of 10 clean sheets that season. Had his most interceptions per 90 at 1.8. However, that was when he was 26 and hungry for Premier League success. He's now 30 and it shows statistically. He's only averaging 1.06 interceptions per 90 and fewer tackles, 1 per 90. He's an interesting player. He's Premier League level, but again, lower end Premier League level, and he has been since that near relegation campaign. Craig Dawson's his partner in crime at centre-back, and despite playing in the Championship last year, is a Premier League quality centre-back looking back at his career. He's an average one. He's not above average, he's not below average, but he is an average Premier League quality centre-back. He's more of a cut-off style centre-back, with more interceptions than Cathcart historically, and fewer tackles. And that seems like a really, really good fit when you've got one tackling centre-back, one kind of more reading the ball. That's kind of what you actually hear a lot of people say bigger teams need to look for. But when both aren't great and sometimes look below average, it creates a really kind of meh defence. And neither are great on the ball, so it leaves a lot to be desired. And their backup, Christian Kabasele, genuinely looks like a replacement for either of those two. So there might be a little bit of hope. He statistically could fit in either role and is a better on-ball defender than both. In terms of when he's dribbling with the ball. He is 28 though, so not exactly a young, exciting replacement for fans to get behind. The time to do that would have been maybe 3-4 seasons ago. And now we get onto a position that, for me, when I watch Watford play, is so glaringly fucking atrocious. It blows my mind. Let's talk about Jose Holovas. Okay? He's 35 and still starts at left back for Watford. He was already 32 the year they almost dropped down to the Championship. He had his worst season by far in terms of interceptions last year, and looks so far past his prime that he's almost not worth talking about. They've got no real filling right back to replace him, and he's a massive problem. He averaged less than half the interceptions per game than in the near relegation season in 2016. He averaged 0.75 last year. That's awful for a right back. It's utterly ridiculous that he's still playing football, let alone starting for Watford. Now let's talk a little bit less statistically minded about the midfield duo of Doucouré and Capoue. Doucouré is a good footballer, an above-average defensive midfielder, and probably one of the first Watford players to be transferred back into the Premier League if they do in fact go down, as I'm predicting. He's okay. He looks really good on the ball. He's young, he's French, which always adds to his value. He would go back into the Premier League, probably mid-table. He's a serviceable player. He's not amazing. He's not going to get you off your feet every match. He hits a couple of long shots that I remember off the top of my head. He's good. He's not great. Capoue had statistically his best season for a while last year, and he has looked okay in the first 2 games of the season so far. So, while not being a liability, he isn't a bright point. Let's move further up the pitch. We've got Will Hughes, who was a young prospect a few years back, as almost any 18 to 22-year-old English player seems to be. But he had a weird anomaly that you don't see very often these last few years. In the 17-18 season, he had 2 goals and 3 assists. In the 18-19 season, he had 2 goals and 4 assists, which I guess some people would call an improvement, but he played over twice as many games in the latter season. Almost triple the starts as well. That shows to me that he won't really reach a potential level that people tout young English players to hit. It kind of is a recurring story nowadays, but when you play double the games, have triple the starts, and average 1 more assist, that's a letdown if you're Watford's scouting department and hoping for a bigger return on investment there. Roberto Pereira is a 28-year-old Argentinian winger / kind of number 10 role player. And I remember when he went from Juve to Watford in 2016, it was touted as a big move. Kind of a shocker for Watford to get that move. And I remember seeing it on social media at that time, and it was a very interesting move. It piqued my interest. But apparently, that didn't save that team from being in a relegation battle the season that he arrived. He averaged 2 assists that year in 12 starts. Not terrible. But since then, has never bettered his assist total. Despite more games and more starts. He's bettered his goal ratio, but not drastically. In the 17-18 season, he had 5 goals. But a much better shot to goal ratio than the season that had just passed, where he had 6 goals, which again people would see as an improvement, but he had nearly double the shots. 33 shots in the 17-18 season to 57 shots in the 18-19 season. That's nearly double the shots, but 1 more goal. So not exactly an improvement, and not a world beater, but not terrible. I think Juve were right to let him go when they did. He might be okay in the Serie A now, but even not up to Juve's standard. Probably a mid-table Serie A team, which really puts you in relegation in the Premier League standards. And now we get on to the strike force. And Andre Gray has never been very good. Never really above average. And to prove my point about him being kind of a weird player at Watford, he was signed after the near relegation from Burnley, who had identical points that year. And he has never equalled or bettered the goal tally that he had for Burnley that season. That's all I really need to say about Andre Gray. He's never improved from a equally likely to be relegated team that they signed him from. Gerard Deulofeu is a kind of a bright spark. He had his best season ever last season, with 10 goals and 5 assists. And at 25, this season will tell us how far his ceiling really reaches. But I can't really tell where his best position is, neither can Javi Gracia. Really. He kind of plays right wing better than he does striker, but because Deeney and Gray are kind of crap, that he kind of needs to play striker. And he finds himself out of position a lot because he's a goal threat for them, rather than being a creative player. And now onto the big one. Troy Deeney. He's 31 years old and seems poised to play yet again a lot of games for Watford under Javi Gracia. He used him a lot last season. 28 starts in the Premier League, 32 appearances total, and 9 goals total. But that was off of 64 shots from Deeney that season. Deulofeu had 60 shots that season. He was mostly playing right wing, and he had 10 goals. So it shows their reliance on other outlets outside of Deeney because he's just not good enough. He's 31 and has a bit of a lore with Watford after the dramatic 96th minute playoff semi-final winner in the promotion campaign in the 14-15 season. You know, the one where Knockaert misses a penalty, gets double saved by Almunia, put up the pitch, kind of gets crossed in, headed down to Deeney, and he smashes it in, takes his top off, runs into the crowd, and then they end up being promoted that season. And that's great that he's a bit of a Watford hero, but the fact that he's still been their main striker every season since that season, without any real deviation from that, and not really an above average goal output from him, shows the overall lack of ambition on behalf of Watford. We'll talk about their bench briefly from that game. Their bench was not very good and really not utilised in a very effective way. Welbeck came on. But when you're relying on Danny Welbeck, who's never been a great player and always been injury prone, that's a problem. Jan Matt was on the bench, Tom Cleverley, Andre Gray, who's past it. Domingos Quina is a young prospect, but who knows what his ceiling is or how well he could even fit into the Premier League. We haven't really seen him much in the Premier League. We'll talk about Ismail Assar, who was the big transfer for them. He's a League One player. Shows a bit of ambition, but it was really the only big move they made in the off-season. I don't love it, looking at him statistically, but he's okay. He could potentially add to that team. So the basic problems of Watford are they haven't really developed since coming up and since nearly being relegated. They were only really assisted that season by pretty terrible teams below them that kept them afloat. And for me, they're going to go down this season. They've got too many holes. Not good enough strike force, terrible defence. Jose Holovas starting at left back. He's 35 and never been very good. It's hard for me to say this because I like Watford. I think they were a good team. Before that first season they came up, I liked watching them. Last season I enjoyed watching them. But something's not right this season, and looking at their squad, you'd start to realise why something doesn't look right. And for me, they're a little bit more of a relegation lock than Brighton are, in most people's eyes. Brighton seem like they have a little bit more ambition. They went out and spent more. And under Graham Potter, they look like they're firing on all cylinders. But Watford do not look like they're firing on all cylinders, maybe not even any. Maybe next week I might talk about Brighton and go further in depth on why they have done things right and are poised to beat the drop this year. Anyways, thank you very much for listening, as per always. Leave a like if you feel so inclined, subscribe if you are new or just a fan of the Nutmeg Podcast. Leave a comment and go ahead and watch other episodes if you'd like. Thanks as always, and goodbye.